the things we grew up hearing about ourselves will obviously affect the way we live our lives. So I grew up thinking that this part of me was wrong. That will affect anyone.
On this episode, we've got Christine, who has been a huge voice of encouragement and fuel for this podcast, helping to promote it even before it was out in the world. She's very active and open in the Tourette community. And just like with Melissa C. Water from the last episode, whom Christine knows well, they were actually both separately on episodes of the TV show Employable Me. That's the name of the show, so when you hear us bring that up, it's a show about people looking for jobs while dealing with what greater society, i.e. employers, might view as a disorder or disability. We talk a lot about that, the television portrayal of Tourette's and what somebody with Tourette Syndrome goes through being the portrayal. Listen to Christine talk about how fair or unfair that might be and what happens when maybe they get it right on TV. I mean, again, another episode that just builds and builds. Do not bail out early on this one. So many takeaways and important points. Otherwise, in general, Christine does so much awareness work for Tourette Syndrome that she probably doesn't need much of an introduction from me. She does videos on YouTube. She works under the name Ticking Out Loud. She writes blogs. She's active in the Tourette community, and the community's lucky to have her. She hasn't always been open about it. And after she started opening up publicly about Tourette's, things really weren't that easy. And we get right to it. Here's my talk with Christine.
My name is Christine Belanger, also known as Ticking Out Loud. I live in Toronto, Canada. Mm-hmm. I am 44 years old. I have Tourette Syndrome and a number of comorbidities.
And so with Tourette's, how long have you lived with it or been cognizant of the fact that, this is what I have and this is what I deal with in my life? When was your diagnosis?
I've always been aware of grimacing and making little sounds. Yeah. But the first time that I realized that a full word had fallen out of my mouth, I was about 7 years old, so grade 2. And it was in a school activity, and I called whoever that was, Mama, which is mother in French. And I was mortified. And of course, I backtracked. I was like, no, that's not what I said. And, I got some looks. Yeah. And about a year later, I remember one of my mother's colleagues, she was an occupational therapist. So I went to meet one of her colleagues, and I knew it was one of her colleagues because he was familiar. And I remember throughout the entire time that we were there, I remember him saying repeatedly, Tourette Syndrome, Tourette Syndrome, Tourette Syndrome. Huh. So that's what I remember from that meeting with my mother's colleague. But we didn't talk about it on the way home. We never talked about it again, ever. Huh. Ever.
But so that was the therapist basically delivering a diagnosis or pronouncing it and it not coming up for...
Ever. My mother passed away in 1996, and we never talked about it ever again.
Wow. So...
Yeah.
So was that a memory that just stuck out and you're like, okay, I have to talk to somebody and hear it for myself directly from a doctor, or how did that work?
Well, before I got to, okay, I need to do something about my Tourette's. First of all, that kind of reaction not being an isolated event, okay. From as part of the relationship with my mother, there's a lot of very similar experiences that I had to address first and really understand the pattern before I got to the Tourette Syndrome, because right. Tourette Syndrome not being acknowledged, it was just part of so many other parts of me that went completely unacknowledged. So from my early 20s on, I started working on myself on those unacknowledged parts of me. And of course, ignoring Tourette Syndrome because I was still not ready to address it. With what I knew of the mental perception and what little I knew about myself, what was normal, what wasn't, I had not ever been connected to the Tourette community. It's not a fun thing to go through alone. So I had to break the pattern of, Tourette is wrong. But before I got to, breaking that pattern, I had to break a lot of other patterns, right? The things we grew up hearing about ourselves will obviously affect the way we live our lives. So I grew up thinking that this part of me was wrong.
Yeah.
That will affect anyone, no matter what part of you is
sure. Yeah.
thought of as wrong, right?
Yeah.
So I was about my late 30s when I started realizing that Tourette syndrome could not go ignored anymore. I was in a long-term relationship for 10 years, so starting my mid-20s, with a neurotypical guy. And of course, at that time, I was still not comfortable with Tourette syndrome. So, of course, I was with somebody who agreed with me.
Yeah.
It's very much the way it is. You find people that will treat you the way you treat yourself. If you treat yourself
Right.
poorly, you're going to find a bunch of people who agree with you. And that's kind of normal, right?
Yeah.
And I did that for years.
That's a good way to say it.
We do that a lot,
Yeah.
Tourette or not. That's something that we all do as human beings. We're all damaged. We're all flawed. And the way we handle it and either grow within it, grow out of it, as long as there's some kind of growth that happens over time, and that growth is not always, clearly measurable.
When you decided to kind of take more ownership and maybe kind of change your direction a little bit and change your tune, set some context. What kind of tics were you exhibiting? Was it something that was really noticeable when you went out in public, or what was the person you were at the time?
Okay, so in that long-term relationship, that guy never told me what facial tics I was making or what it was, right? I only saw his reaction to my tics.
Yeah.
And it was always the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. Again, you find people who agree with you. And at the time, I agreed with him. So I came off of that. It was never talked about really in the relationship. And post-relationship, obviously I've been living by myself, so nobody's telling me if I'm ticking. So when I went back into the workplace full-time, most of my life I was self-employed. And then all of a sudden I get an office job where I'm in there, from either 9 to 5, 8 to 4, something like that. At the time I had a routine. So get up, go to work. I was taking smoke breaks at the time because I was a smoker. At lunchtime, I would go home, walk the dogs, go back to work, take my smoke breaks. So throughout the day, I didn't realize how many tics I was releasing throughout the day. Right.
Yeah.
And then I quit smoking. So one of my many attempts. So that was like 2009. So I quit smoking. So all of a sudden, I'm only leaving the office to go walk the dogs at lunchtime.
Okay.
And I didn't realize that I was grunting, making faces, and so on and so forth. And of course, I was not comfortable with Tourette syndrome. I did not know I was making those faces, grunts. So when I get called into the office by my boss, who lets me go because I rolled my eyes at one of the salespeople.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was not comfortable with Tourette syndrome, so I was not going to bring it up.
Right. Yeah.
I was not aware I was ticking, so I could not warn them this is what I was doing.
Yeah.
But when he gave me a description of the things I was doing, internally I went like, oh my gosh, I really have to do something about this.
So did you say something at the time? I mean, was that boiling up in you? No.
No. I mean, I wanted to say something, but I was so stunned.
Yeah, of course.
I was so stunned, right? So to me, that was a wake-up call. And at the same time, that wake-up call put the ownership on me, because up to that time, I had completely ignored my Tourette's. And by ignoring it, I could not make friends with it. And by not making friends with it, I could not deal with it and live with it in a way that worked for me. So I started exploring it a little bit. And, everyone in my close circle knew I had Tourette syndrome, but I could not educate them very well because, again, not connected to the community. Yeah. I've got an idea why I was so scared. I was not comfortable with my Tourette's. Again, a lifetime of being told it's wrong. It's very hard to embrace something like that.
And you thought by sort of connecting and finding a community that it was going to be kind of a scary place to acknowledge? I mean, is that kind of what was holding you back from that part?
Yeah. Yeah. So after that, of course, I started smoking again. I eventually, found work that I, was really, really good at, got paid really well for. But again, I quit smoking and didn't realize how much the change in routine was affecting my tics.
Yeah.
And that's when I went like, okay, I got myself re-diagnosed, just, to protect myself and to allow myself the resources. And it was also the first time I spoke to an employer about having Tourette syndrome.
So what was the reaction like? How did that go about?
So what happened, change of routine, I had moved a little further away from work, so I could no longer take lunch breaks at home. So I was not releasing my tics at lunch. I was not releasing my tics at break. So, of course, it started affecting me at my desk. So I talked about what was going on. My colleague that was right next to me was aware of it, and he was like totally cool with it. But when it came to talk to my bosses about it, it was met with a bit of reluctance. And I understand reluctance. I mean, if all you know and what most people are aware of is the coprolalia, just because it's a little more, that's what people associate with Tourette syndrome, and it's so much more than that. There was a bit of reluctance.
How did they express their reluctance? I mean, did they, when you told them, did they say, oh, isn't that the swearing disease? Or, I mean, did that, was it a misunderstanding off the bat?
Oh, yeah, of course. I think one of the first things I heard was like, oh, is that where you swear a lot? And at that time, I was not, my coprolalia at the time was not swear words. It was just very socially inappropriate comments, but no swear words at that time. Because coprolalia will take many forms. But at work, I was able to redirect them as little sounds and little twitches and so on and so forth. When I when I really started addressing things that I realized that it was going to really affect my life is, okay, after I was let go of my job, of course, I was looking for work, but being let go from my job meant I couldn't afford my car anymore, so I couldn't fix it. So all of a sudden, for the first time in my adult life, I'm back to public transit, and I had forgotten how hypersensitive I am on public transit and how much I am not comfortable with it. So for the first time in my life, I started trying to control Tourette with medications. That was horrendous.
So did you go through a series of different kinds of medications and just rejected them all, or how did that go?
Well, it was interesting. I've tried everything. One of the first recourses, for some reason, are antidepressants and antipsychotics, because it does affect some of the same brain systems, but it's obviously not the same process,
right?
Because Tourette is motor. It's not psychiatric or psychological. It is motor.
Right.
So, I tried to control it via different kind of medications. So I remember gabapentin for the first 4 hours. It was this quiet, and all of a sudden I was like, hallelujah, I'm rid of it. And then after 4 hours, my body started twitching again. So we upped the doses very quickly because, again, I'm hypersensitive and will respond quickly, but also build up resistance quickly.
Right, yeah.
So before I knew it, I was close to maximum dosage. I was still ticking, and I was going brain dead. I was aware of my thought processes slowing down. So I experienced that with the GABA, with the antipsychotics, with the antidepressants, and a whole other cocktail of different pharmaceuticals.
Well, so with your thought processes kind of slowing down, I mean, how did that affect you in other aspects of life? I mean, was it just processing information around you, or was it completing tasks, or?
I was just aware that my processes were slower. I was still performing at work. I was still able to go through the day, but I felt my processes were slower. I'm used to having, a couple hundred things on my mind at any given time, pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's okay, but also the thinking processes and all those things. So to me, it slowed down my thinking process to I was very frustrated with my thinking process. And I think it's at that moment that I realized that Tourette is what makes my brain work the way it does.
Yeah.
So trying to get rid of the tics is actually what got me to eventually embrace them.
Gotcha. So yeah, when did you, I mean, did that just come as an epiphany, or do you remember like when that thought really kind of like crystallized in your mind?
Well, I know I was working up to it because I remember after I tried the gabapentin, we went on benzodiazepines, which did offer relief, but also created problems in the sense of it made me suicidal. And I was not depressed at the time. I was just anxious. So, and I only realized that after I went off of them, how closely I was. Because you start with Tourette syndrome being a disinhibitory disorder, and then you throw in some benzodiazepines, which help disinhibit the prefrontal cortex processes, the frontal lobe. So you put two disinhibitions together, and it might affect people differently. So I'm glad I went off of them. After the gabapentin, I just went like, okay, I'm going to give a try to a couple of other things, and then I stop. Yeah, I think it's like the third or fourth drug that I tried that I went like, I think Tourette might be, part of what makes my brain great.
Yeah.
And I started realizing that my brain on full Tourette's was at its best. And at that time, I contacted Tourette Canada to, become an in-service volunteer. I went through all the training, and, I learned a lot about myself because, again, I was not connected to my community.
Right.
So I went in and took the in-service training, and then we kind of left it at that. I never heard from them for a long time. And then a couple of years ago, I went again for the in-service training, and one of the attendees, you might know her as Melissa Seawater, or I Drank the Seawater.
Of course.
She was in the audience, and we met there, and I won't lie, meeting with Melissa and connecting with her afterwards, I think to me was the personal catalyst of, okay, you know what? Tourette syndrome can be totally badass. Tourette syndrome can be totally okay. Tourette syndrome can be really awesome. And then, of course, I started connecting with others in my community, and, sure enough, everyone brings something absolutely beautiful and unique. So to me, that was kind of, I was obviously prepared and working myself up to that moment prior to that, but pretty much, let's call it May of 2016. May of 2016 is when that big shift happened. It's like, okay, this is good. This is great. And that's when I decided, I was toying with the idea. It's like, I have to do something. What we have now is not the right thing. But also at the same time, I was, looking for work and so yes, I was not completely focused on that. And and of course, before I met Melissa and before I contacted Tourette Canada, I had found the occasional documentary about Tourette syndrome online, and it was very hard to find positive depictions of it.
Yeah, a lot of them are really, really depressing, kind of downer, kind of focused, or some are very extreme or sensational in their approach. I mean, is that what you saw?
Yeah, of course, the negative representation. And of course, people, as you say, the sensationalized version of it, I mean, it is so extreme. And I'm not going to deny it. It is extreme, but at the same time, it's so much more than swearing. Nobody thinks that how mortifying it is to swear out of control. Just last week, I live in Toronto. One of the many reasons why I live in Toronto is for its diversity. It's a beautiful place. It's multicultural, and I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my tics is blaster. So when I take that in my living room out of context, nobody cares, right?
Yeah.
I was walking in the mall last week, and a few women with head coverings walked by. And of course, I go, blaster. Do you understand how mortifying that was to me?
Did they turn and notice or give you a face?
I hope they didn't. I really hope they didn't, because so if anyone who's listening, it is mortifying because I don't feel that way at all.
Of course not.
About
of course not.
The Muslim population, and like you come to Canada for better opportunities for yourself and your family. My neighbors are immigrants. I mean, like Toronto is a place of immigrants, so of course you're pretty hard done by if you're in Toronto and you're racist or closed-minded. Toronto's not the place for you. So something like that is quite mortifying. Most of the time, I don't really care what I'm picking, but that's fairly recent also, because connecting with my community and so on and so forth, and making friends with the Tourettes. When Employable Me Canada called me.
Yeah, and how did they find you? Was it just through the association?
No, actually, it was through Melissa.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because she was on episode 2. I was on episode 4 of Employable Me Canada.
Right.
The producers got in touch with me, and I wasn't too sure at the time. I was speaking to producers more than 6 months before we started filming. And of course, we went many months without being in touch. I just figured, it was not happening. And then in December of 2016, I get a call, and it's like, Christine, we're gonna do a demo reel. I'm like, oh, okay. I had lost my job the week prior, so talk about timing. So of course, 2 opportunities. First of all, I went like, maybe if I'm upfront about Tourette Syndrome, it might be easier to find a job. Maybe if there's a camera crew, it's going to help make it a little more easier to welcome or at least have some kind of openness of mind as to hiring.
I get that.
So I just figured, okay, so that's an opportunity. And at the same time, as I said, I had been toying with the idea of better resources for Touretters.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So, of course, when that came up, I just went like, okay, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to get my voice, and this is what I'm going to do.
Okay.
So I basically, accepted. I wanted to raise awareness. I won't lie, I was a little skeptical about finding work through them.
By way of the TV show.
I found work, but it was not through through the shooting period.
And I gotta ask you real quick too. The skepticism, based on what you had watched online, videos that don't necessarily match up with your experiences, or at least how you feel about it. Were you also skeptical as to your portrayal?
Yes, skeptical about the portrayal, skeptical about people's motives for being on the show. I had seen the UK version.
Just to clarify, there's a British version of the show and there is a Canadian version of the show. Okay.
Having seen the UK version, I went, yeah, you know what? It's going to be a good angle, great approach, and so on and so forth. And throughout the entire shoot, the director is like, "You're getting a voice," So I'm like, great. I made a bunch of contacts. As I said, I was skeptical about being able to find a job through the show. The producers at Employable Me Canada, they know television really well. Okay? That is what they do. And first things first, they are very good at it. They know television. I found, again, aware I'm on a television show, aware, you got to get ratings. I'm aware of all that. I don't think they quite understood what my challenge really was, because I'm bilingual. Everyone wants me on the phones, right? But nobody wants to accommodate me working from home. So when I go to a bilingual recruiter and I tell them I need to be working from home, they're like, nope. I'm like, what's the difference? I'm staring at a screen and I'm on the phone all day. Nope, they want you in the call center. It's like, I would be happy to take a job just to pay the bills. But the accommodation is not there because it's very hard for me to be in an open office environment. I need, so when I was self-employed, it was great. I would work from home. I would hop in a car, go to the meeting. After the meeting, I'd get in the car, take my head off as much as I need, go on to the next meeting. So I would get that break on a regular basis. So the car for me was kind of like an insulation bubble from all the stimulus. I can deal with traffic and everything if I'm in my little bubble.
Definitely.
Again, not having a car has put has affected my social life tremendously. I didn't realize how much I relied on it. I would hop in the car, go meet with friends.
Yeah.
If I would get overwhelmed, I could always go sit in the car.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, come back home and everything is fine. Now, before I get anywhere, I have to either use public transit or spend a lot of money getting there. So budget being what it is, I stay home most of the time, just because public transit is a huge stressor for me. So that's had a huge effect on my social life.
Yeah. And I don't want to digress, but I mean, that kind of made me realize something about myself too, what you just said right there, because I used to live, 5 minutes from my office. It was just, a super quick drive. I was there, I was done. Now my driving commute is about 30 to 40 minutes in the morning. And people think, but people say like, oh my God, how do you take it? I enjoy it. I've always liked it. I've always felt good, just kind of zoning out in the car on the way home or on the way to work. But I've never really been able to define it. And I feel like that is a big part of it because it is kind of like this release time. It's like a preparation time when I'm on the way to work and a release time when I'm on my way home. I had never thought about that until you just said that.
That's so interesting. And I'm so glad, I'm so glad this is what you're getting out of this.
Yeah. Me too.
What, can I ask you a couple questions?
Of course. Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah. So you're mentioning that. I know for me, that need to be able to release goes beyond the tics. So to me, it's the whole anxiety and ADD that's at play that influences a lot of that. Mm-hmm. Do you have hypersensitivities that kind of add strain on your system where you need to release more? What's it like for you?
It's kind of changed a little bit over the past few years. So I used to be a journalist, a newspaper reporter, and that was a always moving, always on the go, kind of high stress environment. Early mornings, often late nights, writing on deadline, and the anxiety of that situation would definitely make me tic. If I was writing a story on deadline, the editors were sending me an email saying like, hey, is that story coming soon? And just the pressure of that would just kind of kick my tics into overdrive. I did have a place where I could write where I wasn't necessarily around other people. So I kind of felt comfortable, releasing that way. But if it wasn't a situation where it was a packed room of other reporters, other people, because I would work in a newsroom, then it would kind of compound the tics all the more and make me kind of nervous. I would have to get up and kind of pace around because I would get really jittery. I at least tried no other way of dealing with that other than just getting it done and going home and just kind of like feeling this euphoric rush because, there is that whole like thrill of the deadline type thing. You get the story in, it's good. You're feeling good about it. So it's like this reversal of the anxiety and just kind of pulling out of it. And it's almost like getting pulled out of a well or something like that. And just, feeling really good about it while I'm in a safe place, where I live and I can release all of my tics. But during the process, during this really anxious sort of high tension process of writing the story on deadline or working in a fast-paced environment, I have no idea how much I was actually ticking. I do know I was doing it. I don't know to what extent everybody noticed or was like, that's weird, but everybody has their quirks. That's Ben. I just don't know how I was really perceived because I never had a conversation with my colleagues about it.
Interesting. But it also sounds like you used the anxiety to fuel, to help drive you to that deadline. It sounds like you used it in a healthy way, because not all anxiety is bad.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it can kind of keep you in check sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. It keeps you humble.
Yeah. and beyond there, I am always, even if I'm not ticking in the moment, or even if I'm not, cognizant of what I'm doing in the moment, like, was I ticking for the past 5 minutes? I don't know. I can't remember. I couldn't tell, but I'm always conscious, like really, really conscious of the fact that someone might notice me doing something a little bit off or weird. I don't want to be the awkward person to say, oh, this is Tourette Syndrome and this is what it is. It's not what you think it is. And here's a brochure. It's just, that's kind of weird. And so I know that awareness is big and we're all supposed to kind of jump at the chance of education. But, the fact that I'm always conscious of it and conscious of having Tourette's and don't really know how to explain it to people cold. I think that also kind of does something to me, kind of ratchets me up a little bit.
I totally relate to that because where it was easier for me was when I was advocating for somebody else. Advocating for myself, I get lost, I get jumbled, and so on and so forth. I think to me it's just being accountable to somebody else. Somebody else is relying on me. The information that I provide about this person for this person is going to help that person get the proper support and more likely to get an environment where they can thrive. For me to be able to articulate that for somebody else made it a lot easier for me to have those conversations. So by the time Employable Me started shooting, I had only really advocated for everybody else because I had more negative experiences with employers regarding Tourette syndrome. So by the time Employable Me Canada came back around, I had the experience of interviewing by revealing my Tourette syndrome. So I had been a little more upfront about it, and I had tried to discuss it at various stages of interviews, just to test it myself. I've tested it in cover letters, in the first conversation, a third conversation, after the offer.
Okay.
I've tried everything. I found that every time I mentioned Tourette's, so for example, I was doing a telephone interview a year ago before the show for a sales position for a software company. And, the person I'm talking to is like, we want different thinkers. We want people who are, and, I can see that you've got a lot of success. And I'm like, yes, that's great. And so on and so forth. And he's like, so what do you attribute your success to? I said, well, you keep talking about, wanting different thinkers and so on and so forth. I mean, I've been living with Tourette syndrome my entire life. And I can tell you for a fact, it has been very relevant to my success. There was like a 3-second silence, which felt like an eternity.
Yeah, of course.
And the first thing out of his mouth, I'm not judgmental. No, I'm not. That's it. Something like that. And then he talked to me, I think, for another 20 minutes, just so I wouldn't say that it was because of the Tourette syndrome.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so he was kind of putting on a play after that.
I knew right away when I hear I'm not judgmental, it's like, yes, you are. And of course you don't say that, but with my Tourette brain, just trying to, filter that out, as I'm sure you can relate to. There's so many things that I don't say, thankfully.
Well, did you see that? Did you see that response as maybe, was it a continuation of the negative experiences, or was that like, well, at least this guy's trying to be nice about it? I mean, or did you kind of see it as a kind of like a change in tone a little bit from your past experiences?
No, not really. To me, it's a reaction that people have to make themselves feel better. It's normal to react to Tourette syndrome. I mean, it is so unusual. It is so out of the ordinary, and our brains are designed to notice differences and have it register as potential danger. So, your brain is working fine if you have that reaction to Tourette syndrome the first time. But once you realize what it is, most people get accustomed to it. And notice that people who backtrack and put the emphasis that they're not judgmental, have noticed the judgment in themselves. They're trying to convince themselves that they're good people and they're not judgmental. I couldn't possibly feel that way about another human being. That's what it translates to a lot of times. As I said, it depends on when in the interview process. And it seems that there's no real good way, no real good time, because even after I had been somewhere and a good performer, I perform really well. I've got a strong work ethic. I take a lot of pride in the work I do. I like to deliver results. I've got a work ethic, and part of that probably has to do with gender, age, Tourette's. I feel like I've always got something to prove. So of course, I'm very conscious that I'm under the microscope for a number of reasons. And here's one of the things that's motivating me to a number of things. Actually, I wanted to talk about Employable Me.
Let's get into that.
So when Employable Me started shooting my segment started shooting in March of 2017, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do. I was a bit skeptical about my potential of finding work through the show, but I took the opportunity. I went, okay, you know what? If I'm going to advocate, first of all, this was the first time I was advocating for myself. So the first time advocating for myself, I did it on camera. Huh. It was the first time I was asked to be my full Tourettic self among neurotypicals. Right, and let me assure you, ticking in public with a camera crew and ticking in public by yourself are two very different things. It's a different kind of circus, if you will. So, for example, when we were shooting Employable Me, it's like, I mean, you've worked in journalism, you know that a TV crew is a circus all its own. Regardless of what's going on, what's being shot, a TV crew is, it's a bit of a circus. It will attract attention. So having a camera crew following me around kind of legitimized people staring and being curious and asking questions, because, it must be important. I'm in front of a camera, right? But if I go and I'm by myself, some people are cool with it. But a lot of times I get the weird looks or the pity looks or, and some people talk to me normally because I make it clear that, I might be a little twitchy, but I'm all here. Here. That's always interesting. Say I'm on the subway, I've got the headphones on, I'm preparing for a meeting or something. So if I'm traveling without my dog, I'll be doing crosswords. And I'll do the New York Times crosswords. So I'll be focused on my crossword, I'll be twitching and so on and so forth. And as soon as I'm about to get to my stop, once in a while I get a well-meaning person going, kind of infantilizing me. And it's like, do you not realize that what I was doing was an actual intellectual exercise? Like, do I look like I was doing word seek or something? Actually, word seek can be a very strenuous mental exercise for people with dyslexia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I should not diminish that, right? But the fact that she infantilized me, and she's not the first person. So to me, it feels like it started to show me a lot of things about the way people perceive disability and the way people perceive Tourette syndrome. Because ticking freely in public is not something I had allowed myself to do. I mean, I was still ticking, but maybe in a more controlled manner, redirected somehow. But ticking freely in public was an exercise. And yet people's reactions to it was very different with and without a camera crew. And that's one of the things that I found very interesting. Now, there's a lot of new businesses that are popping up, not only in Canada, but around the world, where there's programs for that basically sell the business case for employers to hire people with disabilities. So, for example, for the population who lives with Down syndrome and the population with mobility issues, it's very beneficial. Why? Because a lot of times, actually recently in Ontario, a law was passed that, even if you've got an intellectual disability, you are entitled to the full minimum wage. There's no charity and stipend and all that. It's not acceptable. You should pay for the work you do, not for, it's like, no, it's not free labor. So first of all, it's positive in the sense that more people with Down syndrome have a place to feel valued and contribute to a corporation. Everybody wants that. So that part is great.
Sure. Yeah.
And then there's the organizations that cater to the actually autistic. All of those organizations, quote unquote, build the business case for hiring people with certain types of disability. They are creating business cases to entice employers to hire for diversity by showing the business case, the value it brings. Does a South Asian person in Canada applying for a job to a Caucasian boss have to provide the business case as to why being South Asian would be beneficial to the company? Probably not. Would they ask a lesbian woman to prove the business case of how her difference as a lesbian woman would benefit the company?
Right. Yeah.
Nobody would think about that.
No.
Why is it okay for me as a Touretter to have to prove the business case why it's okay to hire me as a Touretter? Why can't you just hire me as a director of business development? Why can't you just hire me as, a business optimizer? Like, do you understand that part?
Right.
To me, just the very system that, yes, it does bring benefits to people who have been largely overlooked. And yes, it is positive. But you turn that around and it's like, well, the business case to hiring someone with Tourette's, it's like, what do you do? It's like, I get up, I wash up, prepare myself to go to work, do my work, and go home and make supper like everybody else. Like, why should I have to justify that? Like, do I have to justify the business case why you should hire me as a woman? Why would I have to justify the business case why, you should hire me because I'm 44 years old? It's not just one thing. Like, why is it okay? Like, it puts an extra barrier. It does not help me. I'm telling you, it's putting an extra barrier to my job search. Now, there's two versions to my episode of Employable Me Canada.
And so, during the production of the show, did you feel like there's maybe an expectation on you to perform a certain way? I use perform in quotes, but
actually,
you know what I mean.
I'm glad that you used that word. Again, it's run by neurotypical people. And, they met my expectations of neurotypical people because a couple of times it's like, well, that's not what I saw. And they were like, well, why aren't you happy? It's like, well, because, I can totally see your point, but here's what really happened. And from my perspective, this is what actually happened. And of course, those are things that did not make it to air because it's not, I'm contradicting, I'm not,
What might be an example of something that, let's just say, the cameras were following you around and there's something that might sort of meet the traditional pop culture expectation of what you would see from somebody with Tourette's, but then there's all the other stuff. What else? What's the other side of that? What wouldn't be portrayed that you think kind of pulls away from the accuracy and fairness of representing somebody with Tourette's?
Well, first of all, there was two versions to my episode. The first version, I'm not going to go too far into it, but I can tell you that the first version depicted me as completely helpless. And I realized that after like the fourth or fifth person that replied to me. Everyone was trying to rescue me. Absolutely no one thought of me as a person. It was interesting. Wow.
You got letters and correspondences from people who thought that they could sort of pick you up out of a horrible situation?
Yes. So it was full of people that, so the first episode portraying me as helpless, I got 19 responses. 18 of them were from remote parts of Canada where people were suggesting that my housing problem could be solved if I let go of my expensive Toronto apartment and move in with them in some remote Canadian town of less than 300. And it's interesting how many people came up with that. Like the first one was kind of like, yeah, that's funny. And then after the fourth or fifth, it was not so funny anymore. One person even suggested that, I would totally hire you. And I completely understand why you would need your own office. I mean, I would hire you, but I would put you at the very back of the office because it would be pretty horrendous if the clients heard you.
What?
And what do I reply to that? I was so stunned. It's like
the whole point.
I'm like, wow, that just goes to show you that most people don't understand that this is an accommodation for me. It's not an accommodation for them.
Right.
So, I mean, I was so stunned. I could not say anything to the guy. I just kind of went, and I tuned out of the conversation from that point forward. But those were all the kind of responses I got from the first episode. So,
all right.
So,
wow.
After, whichever number of leads the network had sent me, after a while, I'd had enough, and I was still unemployed, and not one of those people were opportunities for employment because, I was hopeful every time someone was reaching out to me after the episode aired that, it was a job offer. But no. So that's when I realized that the portrayal was not good. Nobody was going to hire me. I went back and analyzed it, and then I eventually said something to the network, who communicated with the production company.
Yeah.
And changes were made. And I won't lie, I am much happier with the second version.
Nice. Okay.
Yes. The second version does show me as someone who needs help, but not helpless. And that's what I was going for. They made a few changes that told a slightly different story, and the results are dramatically different. Just some small tweaks.
Yeah.
So first of all, I can't believe that I said something about my episode. I was very surprised myself. At the same time, if it had only been about me, first of all, I would not have done the show if it was only about me. And I would not have spoken up about the depiction of an adult Touretter if it was only about me. Because I had I do help some parents because I feel like a lot of times, especially parents of a newly diagnosed child, needs to know more about Tourette syndrome. And parents meeting other parents is essential, but I find there's more fear-mongering going on than knowledge being shared. And that's not everybody. That's really not everybody. But I can assure you that for some parents, speaking to me makes them realize that I'm the adult version of their child, and that's not acceptable. So some people just remain within the parent group. An adult Touretter is in a better position than the parent of a Touretter to tell you what's going on in your Tourettic child's mind, the processes that might be happening to your child. So anyway, I help some parents, and one of them, actually more than one of them, but one of them, in her very specific words, said, "Wow, the first version of you is night and day." When she watched the original version of the episode, she went like, "My God, what did they do to you?" And I'm like, "What?" She's like, I watched that and I got scared.
Yeah.
I'm like, "Why did you get scared?" She's like, I feel that my daughter is, going to have that challenge, is going to meet those challenges. And, as I said, being depicted as helpless, I didn't understand the real impact of that until one of the parents brought that up to my attention. It's like, you know what? I'm scared. I watched your show and I'm scared. And I think that was a final straw as to why I spoke up.
Yeah. Well, good for you. Yeah.
And I'm so glad I did. Because I'm very happy with the second version. Yes.
And did they hear you out how long did it take for them to respond and kind of, map out your concerns?
Fairly quickly, once the first conversations took place, everything, the decision was done within 10 days, 2 weeks that, some changes were going to be made and the conversations were had. So I don't know what their process was going forward from there, but they were quite responsive at first. They did hear me out. And that's one thing that I really want to point out. I was heard. I was heard, and that was important. That was very important to me. I was heard. That second version of the episode is proof of that. It's a very different kind of response that I got. All those specific changes, again, the response I got was extraordinary. second time around. Since late November, I've had the best conversations across the board. So many people from other communities, such as dyslexic, actually autistic, ADHD communities have started reaching out to me. And you know, the conversations that are taking place are so fantastic. And there's a lot of commonalities to our challenges, both as human beings, you know, differently wired human beings in a world full of neurotypical people that expect us to behave like them. You know, there's a lot of common threads there. I'm going to take it one step further. One of the things I've noticed, for some reason, for many parents, to discover that their child is so different with a capital D, it's very difficult to accept. And now we're talking about parents who are connected by blood to their child. You know, you're supposed to love your child, and they resist the diagnosis. They live in denial, and so on and so forth. So if a parent who loves their child has such a hard time wrapping their head around difference with a capital D, how am I supposed to explain that to an employer who does not know me from Adam? Do you understand? I mean, it's a big transition, you know, and as I said, let's keep in mind that it's a parent of a child who recently got a diagnosis of Tourette, autism, ADHD, OCD, anxiety, anything that's different. It should not be where the dreams go to die. It's like, you know what? Yes, I'm sure it takes a lot to absorb, but now that you know, you're in a better position to know your child better. You're in a better position once you understand and know your child better and what their challenges are. It's a lot easier for you to help accommodate the environment around them so that they can start to thrive. If we start with that kind of mentality, I'm sure it's going to make for much healthier adults. But I know it would have made a world of difference to me.
I'll have links to Christine's awareness work and videos in the show notes with this episode at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Gotta say, the interview I did with Christine here went a good 2.5 hours. Some other things I want to highlight real quick that she brought up during the conversation that I think are pretty important. When it comes to organizations that represent a population of people that haven't always gotten a fair shake, whether it's a neurological issue or something on the spectrum of physical disability, you name it. When it comes to organizations representing those populations, Christine wholeheartedly believes, and I agree, that they should give people from that population leadership roles in that organization. Some obviously do, but it's important to point out. Again, that's something from our interview that we didn't get to in the listening portion of this episode, but it's important to keep in mind. Lead by example. So before I sign off for this week, I just got to say thank you again for all the support, all the emails, and the iTunes reviews and things like that. I mean, just anywhere where you can place a thought that supports this podcast, that really helps, because it's not about me. It's not about supporting me. It's about supporting the community and just this chance to just have a conversation, or the chance to listen to two people who have Tourette syndrome have a conversation that isn't cast in the light like Christine was talking about earlier, the sort of sensationalized and inaccurate portrayals of what living with Tourette syndrome might be like. Yes, we need awareness. Yes, we need funding. Yes, we need support, but it's got to be accurate. We've got plenty more top shelf conversations ahead in future episodes. Again, every Friday, there's a new episode. You can check out what's up so far at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn. Again, tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. That's the website where all the episodes are. Join in on Twitter. My handle is @Tourette'sPod. And you can also use the hashtag Tourette'sPod. Shout out to the multiple additional people I've run into or I've heard from via email or on Twitter who also have the weird ear popping tic. I guess this thing is not so weird after all. A lot of people have this strange ear popping tic. I love knowing that I'm not alone in that. That's the point of the podcast, the greater point anyway. But all right, that does it for this week. Thanks for listening. This is Ben.